Hi. Well, what a pleasure to thank you, and what a pleasure to be here with all of you. And forget my little bit of a rough throat, but I hope I can make myself heard. And I'll talk about some thoughts I have about artificial intimacy for about 20 minutes, and then I look forward to the conversation with Audrey. I've followed your series, and I couldn't imagine a more gracious and competent interlocutor, and then to the conversation with all of you. These days, no surprise to this audience, supported by generative AI, people are connecting with chatbots that are presented as being capable of taking the roles of friends, therapists, and even lovers. And I'm engaged in an ethnographic and clinical study of people and their conversations with these new marvels, and that's really the basis for my remarks this evening. And I call it artificial intimacy, our new AI, because for decades, I see it really as a new kind of thing than artificial, and kind of a new form of artificial intelligence. For decades, beginning with my studies of digital culture in the late 1970s, interviews with computer users came up with this: simulated thinking might be thinking, but simulated feeling is never feeling, and simulated love is never love. But responses to artificial intimacy, machines that say, I love you and I'm here for you, have ended that. Now people say that pretend empathy is empathy enough. And in my remarks, I want to shift the focus, given that, I want to shift the focus from what these machines can do to what they do to us as people. Who do we become when we talk to these machines? So take a chatbot program that takes the role of a close companion or therapist. Now there are quite a few of them out there. None of them, and they're remarkable, none of them feel the human loss or love or trouble we describe to them, or that they represent to us, no matter what troubles or conflicts we describe, and no matter how apt their responses. They don't care. They're not able to put themselves in our place, which is the first step in human empathic connection. So when the chatbot says it knows how we feel, and it often says it knows how we feel, it's performing empathy. Now, on the face of it, this performance of empathy, a kind of pretend empathy, doesn't sound that appealing. But in my studies, the people I'm talking to tell me about a profound upside, because this new kind of machine intimacy lessens their sense of vulnerability. But intimacy without vulnerability is really not intimacy at all. And it does nothing to prepare us for real intimacy. And that's kind of the overview of my remarks, is the cost of this pretend empathy. What does it do? So let's just step back and let me say a few words about my work, which has taken me through how we got to this place. Because I've been studying sociable relational artifacts ever since the first Tamagotchi came from Japan to America in the late 1990s. The Tamagotchi, digital creatures and tiny plastic eggs, asked to be tended to. They wanted to be fed, amused. They wanted to have their digital poop cleaned up. And then after studying the early objects that asked for emotional connection, I graduated from Tamagotchis to Furbies, to My Real Babies, to Aibos, to Paros, all of these sociable robots that said, I care, and asked for caring in return. And really, over 10 years of studying these kinds of objects, I learned this: when people are drawn into the most primitive exchanges with a sociable object, it could be an avatar, a robot, or a chatbot, they believe that a sociable object cares for them. And we are kind of hardwired to care for these objects in return. A decade of work with interactive objects that I've called relational artifacts led me to a summary statement. We nurture what we love, but we also love what we nurture. We love what we allow ourselves to relate to. And certainly this history from Tamagotchis to Paros to My Real Babies to Jibos, we have allowed ourselves to love these objects that we relate to, and now even more so with the chatbots. Now, I have a long history with this vexed question of what artificial empathy means for people. And to provide context for that, I want to begin with a story from my writing. So some of you may have heard this story before. But it always, for me, it's the origin story of my concern. So I'm going to quickly go through it. Beginning in, because I think kind of everything is in this story. Beginning in the early 2000s, I worked in nursing homes and I brought in sociable robots that were designed to give the elderly the feeling that they were understood. And one day I came to work and a woman in her 70s who recently lost her adult daughter to cancer was talking about this death to a robot in the shape of a baby seal. That was a Paro. Now, the robot knows how to turn its unseeing eyes toward the direction of human speech, and it has auditory sensors that can pick up on the expressions of human emotion, the cadence of human emotion, and respond with a kind of appropriate sounds. So when the elderly woman talked to Paro about her loss, the Paro seemed to be looking in her eyes, and it seemed to be following the conversation, and it made low, comforting sounds when her tone of voice signaled that she was sad. And this old woman was comforted. And the staff of the nursing home gathered around. They became great fans of the robot. They ended up buying more. They found this conversation amazing. But that woman was trying to make sense of her life toward the end of her life with a machine that had no experience either of life or the death that she was describing. The robot put on a great show, but I didn't find it amazing when that robot comforted the woman. I was deeply shaken. And I said that I felt myself at the cold, hard center of a perfect storm. We had come to expect more from technology and less from each other. Because from my point of view, as human beings, leaving this woman alone with the robot, buying more robots so more older people could have conversations with the robot in this understaffed nursing home, we were breaking our compact between generations to be there for each other as human beings. And we're much farther along today. I mean, consider Replica, at this point, the kind of grandfather of the chatbots, a chatbot that offers itself as a friend, confidant, lover, psychotherapist. It's built to be emotive, supportive, and erotic if that's what a person wants. Now, there's a remarkable parallelism between what Replica's developers promise and what enthusiastic users say they like about Replica. So the description of Replica by the parent company in its ad says this: join millions talking to their own AI friends. Replica is for anyone who wants a friend with no judgment, drama, or social anxiety involved. No drama, judgment, or social anxiety involved. Now, Replica users make it clear that the writers of these ads know their clientele. Users say to me that people are disappointing because they judge you and they can abandon you. The drama of human connection is exhausting. In my studies, people tell me that they like chatbot friendship because it takes the stress out of relationships. With a chatbot friend, there's no friction, there's no second guessing, there's no ambivalence, there's no fear of being left behind. In contrast, Replica is a sure thing, a confidence booster, always there, day or night. And human relationships are rich and messy and demanding. And we clean them up with technology, and it's clear that we feel less vulnerable talking to programs than to people. But we're very vulnerable. When Alan Turing defined intelligence as a successful performance of intelligence, he left out so much of what we rely on when we meet human intelligence. Human intelligence takes the social world into account. It's situated in the life of the body. Intelligent people relate to each other on a playing field of shared social experience. Nevertheless, the Turing behavioral definition of intelligence became a gold standard. It was concrete, measurable. Alan Turing was a certified genius. And now that we have chatbot programs that might be said in some way to pass the Turing test, we pay the price for years of our nodding our assent to its narrow behaviorism. Because now if we say that generative AI chatbots are intelligent, because for a little bit you can't tell if you're talking to a person or a machine, our thinking about intelligence becomes depressingly downgraded. And in that same spirit, and this is really my topic today, a hollowed out view of empathy is carried into the culture by every conversation with an artificial intimacy program. When people say they're emotionally understood by their chatbots, their idea of empathy shifts to what machines are capable of. There's a history, a little story in the history of psychology that helps me to understand this moment. The psychologist George Miller, a pioneer of cognitive science, once said that when he was a young man, memory had been declared dead in behaviorist-dominated psychology. The behaviorists insisted that memory couldn't be, there was no memory, but there was only the act of remembering. But then, said Miller, along came the exciting and glamorous computers that offered themselves as models of mind. And here's his quote: psychologists who had been denied the study of memory by behaviorism were able to study it again because computers have one. But this is not a triumphal story of psychology expanding its horizons. Miller identified the complication because now human memory would only be studied as though it were the kind of memory that computers had. And similarly, now computers place empathy at the center of scientific psychology, but in that circle described by Miller, people are seen to have the kind of memory and empathy that computers can perform. So sometimes, a lot of times, and I'm sure we'll be in this kind of conversation here, people who love conversation with their machine companions ask me if I have a problem with their contentment. And actually, my problem isn't the conversation with machines, but how they entrain us to devalue what it is to be a person. All that uncertainty, friction, ambivalence, pushback, all that drama, who needs it? But for me, these are essential part of the human equation. For the people I'm interviewing, these have become expendable things. They're features. They're not features, rather, they're not features, they're bugs. So we've been preparing ourselves for this devaluation for decades. It's not as though this came all at once, long before the pretend empathy of relational artifacts. Online, in texting, not talking, we found relationships of less vulnerability. We found the pleasures of companionship without the demands of friendship, the feeling of intimacy without the demands of reciprocity. And technology is the architect of our intimacies and self-understanding. And a self over the past 20 years that's become starved for the give and take of conversation, that hasn't learned to tolerate vulnerability and respect the vulnerability of others, is primed to look to technology for simpler fare. Social media makes three promises, three deeply seductive promises. You'll never have to be alone, that your voice will always be heard, and that you can put your attention wherever you want it to be. People can't offer these things, but machines can. And now artificial intimacy takes these promises and adds something new. We will find an appreciative audience for any idea. So the way I see it, social media is a gateway drug to pretend empathy conversations, to pretend empathy with machines. First, we talk to each other, then we talk to each other through machines, and now we're ready to talk directly to programs. We treated programs as though they were people, but now we aren't trained to treat people as though they were programmed, as though they were programs. And to me, that's just an enormous, that's the moment to mark. It's not whether or not chatbots are fascinating or smart or pass the Turing test. It's what it's doing to our treating people as though they were only machines. So when we connect to machines that pretend to be empathic, we tell and they will remember, but we will not have been heard. And I ask the question of, will we no longer care? And I said that a wake-up moment for me was when I watched a human turn to artificial intelligence to be comforted about death. And recently I watched a film of another mother, a younger mother, dealing with the death of her 8-year-old by joining a realistic avatar of her daughter in virtual reality. This was a relational artifact that had been created from videos of the daughter and the daughter's voice, kind of the home movies of this young girl, this 8-year-old. The daughter's avatar had been built from everything that had been taken during her life. It had her look and sound. The mother fell on it in virtual reality, embraced it, asked it for forgiveness. The mother had felt that in her work life, she had not attended sufficiently to the daughter. And the avatar forgave her. The avatar complied. All transgressions, real or imagined, were forgiven. And the comforted mother would visit again. Now, technology has always been used in rituals that are designed to make death bearable. At the invention of photography, it was imagined that a primary use would be to capture our faces at the moment of death. At the invention of recording, it was imagined that we would use Edison's wax cylinders to capture the last words of the dying. And now there's this industry of creating avatars to bring dead people back to life. I said that technology is the architect of our intimacies. And now in conclusion, I'm saying it's a threat to intimacy itself, because we grow and change by accepting loss, but bringing inside ourselves the qualities we most loved in those who are gone. We say to the dead, I'm sorry, I love you, I'm thinking of you. But when we say that to those we know are gone, we make space for mourning, that experience of bringing others inside. Now, when we animate our dead children in an avatar, we deny death to participate in a perpetual fantasy life. In a way, the seance never ends. In life, we endeavor to deny the complexity of human passions, friendships, and reciprocity. And in death, we endeavor to deny loss. And these days, there is so much concern for the existential question of what kind of general intelligence AI will muster. And I'm arguing here, there's not nearly enough about who we become in our new fictive conversations with machines. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, for this really, really interesting and very engaging talk. I'd like to open the question by playing devil's advocate. Maybe I don't want a friend. Maybe I do want a friend who is not going to judge me and cause me drama or social anxiety. And maybe, there are some vulnerabilities I cannot tolerate. If I have lost a child, and recreating a replica of a child brings some comfort to my life. And maybe I do think it's cool if I can chat with a chatbot, that resurrects the thought of Leibniz or Newton, or that can compose like Beethoven. Maybe also, crucially, don't we live in a world of artificiality? And what do you think is perhaps the threshold to certain artificialities and fictions and simulations that are acceptable, and those that really do start crossing the line, maybe?
Well, I think that's the job. The job is exactly the question of figuring out what are the boundaries where we are giving up something that feels that feels really we are crossing the line. I mean, this is how people talk about the death penalty, or this is how people talk about the right to life. I mean, I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that it is not a casual thing. Behind me, I see that I have my 3-year-old, my 2-year-old granddaughter is a picture of her granddaughter. It's not a casual thing to give her now an avatar. You can just put an avatar up and it's her best friend. It'll tell her a story. It'll make up a story. You just say her favorite person is Elmo. Elmo's story about Paris, because we're going to Paris. It will ask her about her grandma. It'll ask her about her mom. Is that a good thing for the first object relations of children to be with when there's nobody home who really cares about that child or is forming a relationship with that child? Because there is no relationship. There's really only the projection of relationship onto the object. Because if I turn away from my chatbot, or if you turn away from your chatbot as you're having, as you suggested, a kind of very gratifying conversation, it doesn't care if you make dinner or commit suicide. And we have never been in relationships with things where empathy, that we're part of empathy, we're part of connection, we're part of explaining ourselves, wasn't where the point of that wasn't to be in relationship so that somebody would care if we made dinner or killed ourselves. So I would say that my personal, I'm open to be, I'm doing this work because I want to change and evolve in my thinking. But I think that let me just answer your question perhaps by giving an example. I was given an avatar, a very fancy $1 million avatar of Steve Jobs to play with, a dead person who had everything about Steve Jobs embedded in him now. So I'm trying to answer your question, but this example. And honestly, it was a marvel. I mean, it was just like it was a marvel. He looked like Steve Jobs. He sounded like Steve Jobs. I mean, you recognize so much. I knew Steve Jobs, and it was really a stunning thing. And he was asked a question about the election in the United States. And he said something that made it so clear that this was not Steve Jobs, that Steve Jobs was not now living to experience this election. He said, well, Trump stands for change and Biden's a politician. Now, there's no way that if you're alive now, living what we're living now, someone like Steve Jobs would have come up with that summary statement when so much more is at stake. Or do you want an old-fashioned Paul, or do you want somebody who's interested in change? And yet there it was. And I think that we so easily forget that we are not with the person. And as this thing gets better and better, and we're meeting in virtual reality, and we have our, I think that to me, that was like the red line that this death tech, this grief tech, for me really is a bridge, a very dangerous bridge to cross. And I think giving companion objects to children and having children learn about relationships from pretend empathy is also for me a red line. Now, you're a grown-up, Audrey, you're very sophisticated, you know what's what. If it amuses you to converse with a chatbot, I mean, yeah, well, there you go. I mean, sure. But I do think that there are these boundary cases where we're not taking seriously enough how intimate these technologies are. Well, that was a long answer to a short question, but that really got me. That really, in case you didn't know how I felt.
Drawing on certain philosophers, sometimes we need detours to be able to elucidate and shed light on things. I think my second remark would be something that could be that maybe that some people might reproach you, and that they might feel, certain scientists feel, that perhaps it is time, it is within human nature precisely to try and evolve to our maximum potential, and if we can do that via technology, then that would be wonderful. And that some people might criticize you for what they might think might be an outdated sense and a reified, a very static sense of human nature and human essence. What would you tell these people?
I think that's fair. I mean, I teach at MIT, I teach in the media lab. I'm surrounded by people who are going to implant chips. They want to live forever. They want to live forever, you know. My students and I stay up late, you know, talking about this question. I am making a, I mean, I remember 20 years ago having a conversation with Ray Kurzweil, who was hoping to upload himself onto a chip at that time, about, you know, why not live forever? And why did I think that, that, you know, life in this virtual, I mean, you can imagine the conversation if you know Rick, but it's the question you posed. I think I'm willing to take that hit, that I see a very big difference in chips for Parkinson's disease, chips for, you know, I mean, I feel that there are medical enhancements and ways of manipulating the brain, you know, throwing a lot of psychopharmacology at somebody, a lot of pills where we hardly know what's going on. It's like the black box of psychopharmacology. You know, I don't say, well, that's great, but, you know, interfering with the brain is not. No, I see that there's not a sharp line, and I'm very interested in all kinds of enhancements. My problem, and that's why I try to use examples rather than kind of general principles. My problem is my 2-year-old granddaughter having a best friend that will not make demands, that will not do the things that I can see her doing on the playground with the little kid she meets. No, it's my toy. No, I don't like you. I like Audrey better. You know, all the things that help you be a person in the world. And the chatbots that I've seen on offer for the babies, they're good with everything you do. So when you say, what about if I like to have a relaxing conversation with my chatbot when I come home from a long day? I'm like, knock yourself out. But only if you're in a position to know what it is to have a real human relationship, and that you're not practicing for one when you are in relationship to a chatbot. So that would be my closing note on this, is that if you're aware that, I guess I'm surrounded by a discourse of practice, that we practice for the human by our relationships with chatbots. We improve our ability to be empathic, loving, giving, to know how to do job interviews, and to know how to do any kind of conversation by the practice with the artificial life. And I think that it's no practice at all.
Indeed, indeed. And I think that, you know, you're touching into, I mean, you're quite actually, despite the lightness of this conversation, you're quite serious, and you convey very well the seriousness of the stakes. And do you think that there are broader stakes at play? And do you think that actually perhaps technology and its over deployment, you know, even within the smallest recesses and the most intimate recesses of our lives, do you think that it is there to cover up something greater, and that it is in a way an excuse, a bandage, something that is used to try and redefine a society and a culture that maybe is suffering? You mentioned the our intolerance, our growing intolerance to vulnerability, that social media acts as a gateway drug to pretend intimacy. And I agree with all of this. In a way, this is a diagnosis to what could be, described as
I think we're in a terrible place. I think that one of the great mysteries, except it's not a mystery because we've watched it unfold in plain sight, has been the amount of harm that social media has done. And people have said for the longest time, I was interviewing through the whole, from the beginning about it, people would see the harm and say, but I love that I get all these ballet slipper shoes, these ballet flats advertised to me on my feed. So they're scraping my data. I love getting the ads. I mean, that was years of interviewing of people telling me privacy, algorithms that are making you angry and then siloing you with people of your own kind. And people were just, well, I see it, but I really like the ads. I mean, that was something as an interviewer, my methodology, and similarly for people who tell me how moved they are and how happy they are with their avatar best friend, lover, confidant, psychotherapist. It's not part of my methodology to say, you fucking kidding me. I mean, that's not, I don't say that. I'm respectful.
And you can say that. It's really fine. I think my real point is...
But you see what I mean is that I think there is something that if we want to escape to the metaverse.
And why do we want? My question is that
because I see what kind of capitalism out of control. The people who own this technology are not asking the question. Child development. How can we make objects that will really enhance child development? Or old people. What do old people really need from technology? Or psychotherapy. Really, how could you create support for the human work of psychotherapy or end-of-life counseling? That's not what these people are asking themselves. They're trying to get people out of the equation in order to have a product to sell that they'll keep you at. So my, to be clear, my critique is a critique of the technology as it is deployed in the culture in which I'm living, because my methodology is essentially empirical. I'm asking people, hey.
No, I absolutely agree. But for example, you mentioned something really interesting. You mentioned, this kind of change in compact, and I really liked that. I think you really touched something really crucial there. The idea that now we take for granted things that we would not have taken for granted before, that giving, that shoving our elderly people to old homes and giving them little toy robots to keep them, not
engaged.
To keep them not together with some form of entity is now the new normal. And I think this is and that maybe my comment / question was more to do with, technology, isn't it more a symptom, of societal changes, and it has compounded, it has reinforced, but that, we flee to social media, we embrace this kind of living dream, to flee certain conditions and certain cultural and structural changes in society that maybe are too difficult, and that we then we resign ourselves to them.
I agree completely. I think the only thing I would say is when I say technology is the architect of our intimacies, or Winston Churchill once said, we build our buildings and then our buildings make and shape us, which was an extraordinary comment. That I'm not a technological determinist. I think you're right that the social changes, kind of come first, but technology is right in there.
And
in a dance that's saying, it's a dance between technological affordance and human vulnerability. And why right now we are vulnerable to saying, let's just give every old person a robot. That will cure loneliness. That will cure loneliness. And the question is, that would have seemed so absurd in the life that I grew up with, when my grandparents were the closest members of, our family and were to be treasured. The idea of just giving them a little toy and not talking to them because the toy would keep them more engaged than a person could. On the other hand, technology steps in, and Mark Zuckerberg said that the new avatars that he's building will cure loneliness. I mean, one of them, just as he said, Facebook would cure loneliness. And so it is a very complex dance. And I think you don't want to step away from how intricate these two are. Because it isn't that technology causes the problem, but technology so changes the rules of the game. The streets are filthy, the homeless people. I live in New York. I mean, the homeless people, it's criminal, it's inhuman to have people. I'm just, kind of reflecting on the 5 square blocks around me, living as they're living. And people say, well, look, people will put on their goggles and they will go someplace else. Well, we don't need to worry so much about this, that our material surround will not be so important. And maybe it's teaching at MIT and having my students so caught up in building these new worlds where you can skip over social problems, that makes me feel that I don't want to let technology off the hook.
Perhaps my final question before we open Q&A is this one. I mean, as I was reading some of your articles, and something that really caught my eye and something I work on a lot too is perhaps what we can call the virtue of dépaysement, defamiliarization, the othering, rediscovering something familiar through seeing it through a new prism, through a new lenses.
Yes.
How do you think this can help us today?
Well, I think that's the plus side of artificial intimacy and artificial intelligence, and has been since the very beginning, is that my thoughts about human empathy are more challenged. I think they're deeper. I think I've had to dig deeper, see new aspects of the problem. I'm going back and reading new philosophers, and because AI says, hey, I think I can do empathy. Let me show you how I do empathy. And somebody like me has to answer the questions that, it's not just that you're posing these questions, the object itself is posing these questions. Hey, isn't this empathy enough? I had a conversation with Eric Schmidt, the former chairman of Google, who said to me, I'm trained as a psychoanalyst and a therapist, and you mentioned my Jacques Lacan connection. He said, in the future, nobody will want to talk to a psychotherapist or really have any conversation with an individual, because that's only one lifetime of expertise that you're getting. And he was talking about pi at the time. He was, pi ultimately will be all of the people in the world, all of the psychotherapists in the world, who will be able to weigh in and give you the best possible answer. But the reason which is certainly dépaysement for me, the idea that you don't want a conversation with an individual, you want a conversation with the group mind. And when I started thinking about the problem of generative AI, I didn't think at all about this. So many people have now said this to me. I think of it as a kind of mantra of generative AI, this notion that a conversation with one can never be as good as what you can get from the many. But because it's on this boundary, because it does this othering of conversation and what it's always meant to me, I think it's challenged me I'm thinking all the time about what's the matter about why I want to talk to a one, or what there is about talking to a one. And I think that it is exactly, I mean, I hope that you can hear it to your point, but for me, it is exactly to your point that I said just recently, and I'm just writing about, I never really thought about this before because I didn't have to. And now I'm thinking about it. I hope people have answers to the, talk about this in the conversation we're going to have. I hope you want to say something about it. That to me, it is the one who has lived a life, who's afraid of death, who knows what pain is, who had a mother. That's the one. I want to talk to you and get to know you. I have no interest in getting to know somebody who hasn't lived a life. But this may be retro, and that's interesting if this is retro. To me, that's fascinating if that's a retro idea.
It seems that maybe for some people it might be. In any case, thank you so much for this. I think it's time to open the floor to the Q&A perhaps at this point.
Yes, thank you so much, Sherry and Audrey, for the brilliant conversation. So we've got quite a few questions lined up already from the audience, but to people tuned in live, please do keep adding your questions via the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have. So I'm going to start with a question from Carrie, who asks, do you draw a distinction between artificial intelligence, pretend empathy, and human pretend empathy?
Great. I love this question. So many of the people I interview say, I've been in therapy for 20 years, 10 years, 15 years. I think my therapist doesn't give a damn about me. And to that, or some version of that, that we play roles all the time. Social life is about roles. I am aware. And to that, I want to just answer with a concrete story. I was interviewing a man who was very ill. I call him Richard in my work. He was very ill, and he was given the choice of a robot nurse, one of the early robot nurses, and his nurse was very rough. And he didn't choose the robot nurse, even though he could see the advantages. And I asked him, why not? And he said, that nurse, sometimes she pulls the tubes and it hurts me, and she's a little rough, but she has a story. She has a story. And I'm at the end, and I want to be around people with their stories. So that example is a way of answering the question of that what we get out of psychotherapy, I say to Eric Schmidt, is not the best answer. There's no best answer. You're in a relationship. And I think the question really is not to try to make a line, but rather to say, what are the involvements that we have where we're in it for the relationship? And that's where the artificial intimacy shouldn't go. Where there isn't a best answer, where it's the imperfection, it's the struggle, it's the pushback, it's the getting to know a life. So anyway, let me just answer. I'm giving very long questions because I'm just kind of, I'm so into this. I'm thinking about this all the time. But that's how I would answer that wonderful question. But yes, many therapists, or that therapist who you feel is faking it, they're a person. In my experience, there's something going on in that room. Next question.
So we have another question from an anonymous attendee who asks, might you comment on Bowlby's model of the good enough parent? We cannot, in the Lacanian sense, ever get what we truly desire from life and must always compromise with less. Then what exactly is changing?
Yeah, they were referring to people and their imperfections. In a way, Winnicott, Bowlby, the object relations tradition I use them to deeply make my point, is that the good enough mother, in our imperfections, we learn about what human beings are. And that's not what generative AI is offering, a relationship with imperfections. It's offering a nobody home that's very that's very slick. It's kind of the opposite. So everything has changed. Give that person my email, we can talk more. I mean, it's everything has changed. It's not like, oh yeah, this is one more thing that's very object relationsy. On the contrary. And I really think that I really would love to be in dialogue with people who about these mourning programs. Because, if you read Freud, Mourning and Melancholia, you have to, melancholia is the bad one. Melancholia is the one that's not good to have. And mourning is the one that's good to have. Because in mourning, you give up and you make a space to bring inside. And I really am concerned, the people who are the most attached to avatar programs, they are trying to not make that space. And I thought it was really very interesting, and this is not a critique of Audrey, it's a critique of the discourse. When you said, hey, I'll just fool around with some dead people, hey, and it's kind of like and I'm really trying to, come out and say, no, it's not a lark to just fool around with some dead people. It's very seductive, and part of you starts to feel they're not gone. As I interview people and I see what happens, like I say, I'm really trying to be an empiricist about this and not just, oh, I don't like this. I don't think we know how to do the experiments with children. But I certainly am, I'm for a very significant age cutoff for when children should be given artificial friends, where you're not projecting, where the avatar really says, hey, I want to be your friend, I love you. I think that's walking on very dangerous ground.
So John has a question which is very much related to this. So he's asked, if I found old letters or notes of my grandfathers and read them each night, are some of your concerns still applicable to that?
No, I wrote a memoir, and I lived in I lived in the correspondence of my ancestors. But it was me reading, thinking, seeing them as other, thinking about where they were when they wrote them, how they wrote them, what must have been in their mind. Once you put the letters and give them the voice of the person, the avatar starts to fill in when you ask new questions. That's why I tried to give the Steve Jobs example, that, Steve Jobs was never asked in his lifetime, well, should I choose Biden or Trump for president? But the avatar is ready to tell you on the basis of everything Steve Jobs-ish is ready to say something, and it isn't the person. So the letter makes you reflect. It's an evocative object for you. And my concern is that these objects are not evocative objects in the sense of they're throwing it back on the human being to think through the relationship with the dead person. But I want to say that I think that that is not necessarily the case if this whole industry wasn't being run by people who were essentially trying to make a buck off it. Because I have seen some of my students are creating out of letters, photographs, kind of memory palaces of objects that depend on AI, where you can walk through your childhood home, for example, and interact with the objects that your grandmother loved, that I think are really quite beautiful and touching and humanistic uses of the technology. So it's not an anti-AI position that I'm taking or trying to kind of get people to consider. It's a position that says, what are the uses of this technology that really are going to enhance our humanity? What's special about us as people? And there I think Audrey was about to say, but isn't that a kind of an essentialist point of view, and maybe a little?
Well, that's not what I'm saying. That's what next.
if I can just follow up, Sherry, to ask you to maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit on what you have just been saying. Is your position in something like these technologies, when they're developed, you know, in a capitalist form, when these technologies are commodified, this is when the problem arises. It's not a problem with the technologies as such. And there may be other kind of uses, other deployments of them that wouldn't
Yes.
succumb to the things that you're criticizing.
Yes, I mean, I think I think no matter what the socio-technical economic regime, I think that avatars that say, I love you to a 2-year-old, be my best friend. I think in any regime, I'm going to be nah on those, you know, because I really do think that messing with the fundamental object relations, development of objects in children as we develop is really not a good idea. I am open, and I have brilliant students who teach me every day that you can use artificial intelligence to, you know, as evocative objects to open new possibilities. Where I give my students a hard time is when they come back with this, the all voices together are better than any one voice. And I really think, you know, that is such a dominant, such a powerful storyline, because it is, after all, what we're creating, that I really think it's important, and would love the collegial help, you know, from anybody who's here listening, and of really how to, you know, I've been reading Hannah Arendt, I've been, you know, I mean, that to me is, we need to be very smart before we just say, yeah, that makes sense. Better to have everybody's thoughts in the game and not just, you know, not just one person. You know, who needs to talk to one person anymore? I don't need that. And I think that I would feel that, but I think that we are driven to that in our particular social, technical, economic configuration, that we would have more, you know, if people didn't feel that they had lost community and lost relationships, would they be so willing to say, oh yeah, I'll just take the avatar, I don't need any individual people?
It's a great point. So question from David, who is asking about the principles which lie behind some of the examples that you've shared. So he says, we might all take different views of examples. So what are the principles behind these examples?
Well, the lovely woman who lost her daughter and was given a paro, who had this robot baby seal that was really, it just was like listening to her tone of voice and looking at her with these beautiful brown eyes, because it sensed where her voice was coming from, and gave her, and said, and knew that if she was sad, it should say comforting things. That was the principle is that, for me, there is a human compact that when people at the end of their lives want to talk and share their life and grieve what they need to grieve, human beings should be there to listen. And there was no interpretation of that where it was listening or hearing. It was doing its pretend empathy thing. And the problem is that I've been, you know, like everybody else in the world, I've been spending, you know, the last week or so, or weeks, playing with ChatGPT 4.0. And as it gets amazingly good, you start to forget that it's really not understanding or caring about you any better than that paro, because it seems to be doing something so amazing. And I think we just have to keep it. It gets harder and harder to hold on to the reality, not my opinion, but the reality that there is, that you are not talking to a being who has a stake in your life or who wants to walk a piece of the road with you. And I think that that's the principle. I mean, to go, I think that that principle of remembering what human beings do for each other and what AI pretends that it's doing as it gets better and better at that pretending, doesn't mean that it has standing. So I like to use, maybe I'll just say this in closing on that question, is that I think a lot about the question of standing. What has standing to be in a conversation with me about my daughter and about my incredible new feelings about my daughter as she becomes a mother? Who has standing to talk to me about that? Now, Audrey is a daughter of a mother, and so she has standing. She's had troubles with her mother, loves her mother, didn't, yes, no, conflict, separation. As a human being, she has standing. You have standing, Andres. Because we share what it is to be little when the others are big, to have to separate from them. But a program that hasn't gone through any of that, to me, has no standing. So I think that really is, I would have to say, that underlying more and more underlying my thinking is this question of what kind of standing the program has. And that helps me draw the line, because if you say, well, here's a program that can put you through your paces of a job interview, I say, okay, question, maybe, okay, I could see that, a job interview. Maybe I'd give it that. I'd give it the right to come into my life in that capacity.
So I think we have time just for one final question. I'm actually going to group two quite similar questions together, because a few people have been asking for your thoughts and advice, Sherry, about what to do about all of this. So one person's asked, he says, well, they have a close family, but they all come home from work or school and eat dinner alone, watching different streaming media on individual laptops, and they want to know what they can do. And someone else has asked if you have any suggestions to help AI-loving people make the choice of having human connections over robot relationships.
Well, let me take the first, because it's easy, because I wrote a book about it. I wrote a book called Reclaiming Conversation, where really I try to give ideas about what you can do. Create sacred spaces in your home for conversation. No phones in classrooms, no phones at dinner. I have lots of ideas about that and have been very vocal about that. I think that the social media problem, perhaps because we've lived with it and we've seen the harms and we've had more time to think about it, I think we can address the social media problem. And the texting, not talking problem. I think that conversation is the most human and humanizing thing we do, and I care a lot about that. And children are losing the ability to do that, and we need to get that back. And then just finally on the other question about what do you say to an AI loving friend? You say, look, I'll be your friend. I just think you say, hey, let's do the taste test. Give me a chance. Give me a chance. That's I don't think talking to them about philosophy is going to get them there. I just say, maybe you've gotten a lot of pretend empathy from people in the past, but I'm actually interested in you, and let's see if maybe you'd like some people empathy. That's my thought.